Welcome to Context. I'm Brad Harris. I've been thinking more and more about what makes a civilization great and what keeps it great. As I've gotten older, this has become more and more relevant in my mind. It seems to me the defining characteristic of most great civilizations is that their people feel summoned to revere greatness. When citizens feel encouraged to admire excellence without apology, to pursue bold achievement without first performing moral disclaimers, and to be inspired by expertise instead of being suspicious of it, that's not only a recipe for prosperity, but for historic progress. On the other hand, the defining characteristics of civilizations in decline emerge when elite levels of talent and achievement become a form of social taboo, and when the highest social instinct is not to elevate, but to equalize, until the word great itself begins to sound like some kind of threat. I would argue that Western civilization, our civilization, has been accelerating into decline for at least a decade. In particular, meritocracy has been getting crushed. Of course, the irony of this crisis is that our current system still depends on the residual infrastructure of meritocracy, even while it treats meritocracy as morally suspect. What that means is that we are living off of the accumulated returns of a civilization that long rewarded competence, while increasingly training ourselves to interpret talent and hard work as somehow illegitimate. That is not sustainable. And its liabilities are likely to manifest when bridges no longer stand, when planes begin to crash, when courts cease to rule objectively, when medical malpractice mounts, when the energy grid falters, and when the failure rate of countless other facets of modernity begin to rise exponentially. And not only that, it's not only about how more and more things break. It's about how life becomes more tedious, more depressing, more dehumanizing. And it's about how our children cease to dream of greatness for themselves. What I really want to do in this episode is to try to remember how civilizations actually function when they're growing in power and confidence, and how they begin to unravel when their moral priorities invert such that greatness becomes bad. For us, a clear sign of decline showed up when people started to sense a moral vacuum in the soul of Western civilization some decades ago. Many described this as cultural relativism, and it was demarcated by the widespread rejection of objective standards. The objective categories of excellent and mediocre, good and evil, beautiful and ugly, true and false, all lost their footing, and something else rose to fill the void. Resentment. A growing impulse to treat excellence not as a gift to be admired, but as a signal of historical guilt. This was not primarily an intellectual shift, it was a spiritual and aesthetic one, a change in what felt good to praise and what felt righteous to condemn. Here is where building great things began to look morally suspect and tearing them down began to look virtuous. Here is where the highest cultural instinct became critique rather than creation. What's striking is how consistently this pattern appears across very different domains: history, psychology, literature, whenever civilization lurches from confidence and ambition into decadence. And once the attendant moral inversion sets in, the consequences show up most alarmingly in how we choose who gets access to resources and who gets promoted to positions of power and authority. It changes how we select students and aspiring doctors, politicians and tenured professors. Ultimately, it poisons the process of selecting our civilization's leaders at every level. To appreciate the full extent of how this process has infected our own historical moment, we need to remember what it felt like to live in a society that truly did revere the most intelligent, hardest working, most creative, and most courageous among them. There are many ways to go about this, but perhaps some historical perspective on what human civilizations have actually accomplished when they retained the moral permission to aspire to greatness will suffice for now. Consider the Great Wall of China, a construction project spanning 2,000 years and stretching thousands of miles across deserts, mountains, and other unforgiving terrain. This was an audacious, civilizational commitment to protect the fragile, hard-won order of emerging cities, written law, and administrative complexity taking root in the south of China from the volatile, nomadic barbarians attempting to invade from the north to tear it down. The Great Wall required elite logistical coordination, engineering ingenuity, and practically superhuman endurance over generations. Imagine trying to describe such a project to a modern planning committee before it existed. You would almost certainly be laughed out of the room. They'd reject the idea as too expensive, too exclusionary, with too many resources diverted from the poor living within the southern cities that the wall was designed to protect. And yet the Chinese built a wall so great that it still stands centuries later as a testament to their latent power. Move forward in time to medieval Europe and consider the Gothic cathedrals. Towering structures that took generations to complete, often begun by men who knew they would never live to see them finished. Europe's medieval cathedrals were wonders of scale and aesthetic elegance, like acts of spiritual reverence carved into stone. Flying buttresses, vaulted ceilings, stained glass rising hundreds of feet into the air, all manifesting Western civilization's belief that striving upward toward beauty and transcendence was worthy of enormous sacrifice. Closer to home, think of industrial America as it rapidly modernized through the 19th century. Telegraph wires strung across vast wilderness, railroads blasted through mountains, binding together an entire continent at a speed and scale that would have seemed impossible only decades earlier. Now, with an example like this, we certainly start to see how the decadent moral reflex kicks in. The remarkable technological feat of America's 19th century transportation and communication build-out is very often these days reduced to a familiar indictment. Chinese laborers were exploited. Wealthy old white men became even more wealthy, and probably also more white, somehow. Therefore, the entire achievement must be regarded as a grave historical sin. This reaction reveals a profound lack of historical wisdom. First of all, such a critique mistakes the presence of injustice for the absence of greatness. Of course, the railroads were not built by saints, but by human beings operating within the constraints, hierarchies, and blind spots of their time, just as the cathedrals were, just as the Great Wall was, just as every monumental achievement in human history has been. The relevant question is not whether some men enriched themselves, which they did, or whether some Chinese immigrant laborers were treated terribly, which they were, or whether later generations developed more refined moral standards, which we had the luxury of doing based in large part on the prosperity those railroads enabled, the relevant question is whether great civilizational achievements like the Great Wall, the Gothic cathedrals, the American railroads, and countless other examples dramatically expanded the quality of life and the potential of millions of people. On that measure, the answer is unequivocally yes. We need not go back millennia or even centuries to find examples of when civilizations prioritized greatness. It still lives in the memories of millions of our fellow citizens. Imagine what it meant, psychologically, to live in an era when America could decide, out loud, publicly, without embarrassment, that it was going to put men on the moon. Not as a metaphor, not as a branding exercise, as an engineering reality. A nation setting itself an almost absurd objective and then mobilizing the institutional machinery required to achieve it.
But why, some say, the moon? Why choose this as our goal? And they may well ask, why climb the highest mountain? Why, 35 years ago, fly the Atlantic? Why does Rice play Texas? We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills.
The Apollo program depended on a thick ecology of competence: research brilliance, political discipline, laboratory precision, manufacturing coordination, test pilot bravery, mathematical talent, engineering elitism. It depended on the assumption that a society's responsibility was to find the very best people it could, give them real authority, and then let them do the hardest work imaginable. And when it succeeded, it didn't merely produce a stunning technological artifact. Landing a man on the moon produced a civilizational sensation. We human beings can do impossible things. If you sat a typical 21st century politician or administrator or even college student down today and proposed the Apollo project, if you described its risks, its costs, its unapologetic hierarchy of talent, its indifference to symbolic equity, they would not simply say the project was impractical, they would say it was immoral. That the money should be spent not on great technology and engineering, but on subsidized housing, on green energy initiatives, on aid packages to impoverished tribes. They would say that the ambition to land a human being on the moon for the first time is itself offensive. That's the key inversion. Greatness is no longer respected as an aspiration, but targeted as a moral failure. And the argument is always the same. How dare you strive upward when suffering still exists below? How dare you admire excellence when inequality persists? How dare you build cathedrals when people are homeless? How dare you reach for the stars when someone, somewhere is disenfranchised? This argument is toxic, in part because it smuggles in a host of lies. Principally, it assumes that striving for greatness is what creates suffering, rather than what historically alleviates it. In the process, it fetishizes grievance, and it redirects the human gaze away from the best we can be and toward the lowest common denominator of human existence, and then it calls that redirection compassion. But that is not compassion or wisdom of any kind. It is simply the self-sabotage of our species. Let's look at how this moral inversion is already shaping decisions with immediate, irreversible consequences. This is no longer just about history or architecture or national ambition. It's about who we are trusting today with the lives of the people we love. In late January of 2026, the Department of Justice filed a civil lawsuit against the University of California system, alleging that UCLA's medical school admissions process discriminated on the basis of race. Specifically, that Asian and white applicants were systematically disadvantaged under admissions practices that prioritized non-Asian and non-white racial identity over academic and professional qualifications. Strip away all the bureaucratic language and euphemisms, and the question becomes stark. When you are selecting future physicians, the people who will diagnose disease, perform surgery, and make life or death decisions, what principle governs selection? Competence or skin color? According to the Justice Department's filing, UCLA's medical school admissions process systematically evaluated applicants through racial categorization that affected how academic achievement was interpreted. Asian and white applicants with higher college GPAs, higher MCAT scores, and stronger objective academic indicators were routinely scored lower in UCLA's subjective, holistic admissions categories, while applicants from non-Asian and non-white racial groups were advanced with demonstrably weaker academic records. In other words, the same credentials were treated very differently depending on the race of the applicant. This is how discrimination functions in the modern bureaucratic age, not through explicit quotas posted on the wall, but through discretionary scoring systems that quietly downgrade merit in the name of lived experience or institutional values. The result is the same. Applicants who are more qualified are rejected, and applicants who are less qualified are admitted because of their race. Imagine being a black applicant who really did earn a place at UCLA on merit, who studied relentlessly, scored well, mastered the material, and deserved that seat at the table as much as anyone else in the room. Under a system like UCLA's, that black doctor's achievement is quietly poisoned. His competence is no longer necessarily presumed. His excellence is no longer necessarily trusted. Every patient and every colleague now has a reason, however unfair and however unspoken, to wonder whether that black doctor was admitted because he was exceptional or because he was black. That is not progress. That's just a new and even more insidious form of racism. By lowering standards in the name of equity, the institution degrades the standing of genuinely excellent black physicians and burdens them with suspicion they do not deserve. So a policy meant to correct historical injustice only ends up exacerbating it. Call this whatever language makes you feel better: equity, holistic review, social justice, but in functional terms, it is the intentional downgrading of competence in one of the most competence-critical domains that exists. And if that doesn't alarm you, imagine this. Imagine someone you love arriving at an emergency room in a crisis: a stroke, sepsis, a ruptured appendix, a child whose airway is closing, a parent with crushing chest pain. In that moment, no one should give a about the doctor's identity. The only thing that should matter is this doctor good? Can this doctor save my child? And if the honest answer coming out of our vanguard medical establishment is, well, we deliberately selected for something else, then a profound moral crime has been committed, one that masquerades as compassion, maybe, while actively increasing the risk of suffering and death. And make no mistake, this is not an isolated anomaly. Medical schools are pipelines. Law schools are pipelines. Universities are pipelines. If you control selection, you control the future. This is why the UCLA case matters so much. Not only because it's scandalous, but because it's representative. It shows us in a single frame what happens when a civilization loses the courage to say that competence matters more than narrative. UCLA is what civilizational decline looks like up close, one institution at a time. Okay, at this point, many people are not just confused about why UCLA and countless other institutions are systematically destroying our civilization. They're angry. In fact, they feel rage, and rightly so. Because what the UCLA case exposes is not merely a bad policy choice, but a deeper form of decadence, what I would describe as a post-competent mode of authority that's surging across the West. Many of our most important institutions are now governed by people who did not build the systems they inhabit, who do not understand what actually makes those systems work, and who therefore mistake symbolic authority for genuine mastery. Many of them are credentialed, verbally fluent, and politically adept, but epistemically hollow. They have never been responsible for outcomes that punish error. They operate safely within a kind of inherited excellence, mistaking the prestige of their institution for evidence of their own personal competence. They work in beautiful buildings they did not design, rely on institutional credibility they did not earn, and assume the moral authority that confers simply because the institution still functions, for now. And this is what makes our present moment so dangerous. These people are not necessarily stupid, but they are parasitic on past greatness. And parasites never understand the organism they consume. They simply experience the organism as a given. Because they have never had to produce genuine excellence to survive, they do not recognize genuine excellence when they see it. Competence is invisible to the incompetent. So when they look at hierarchy, they do not see mastery earned through discipline and sacrifice and experience. All they see is power. When they look at expertise, they do not see years of training and responsibility. All they see is exclusion. A great surgeon does not look like a master of medicine to someone who has never really taken the time to master anything. That great surgeon just looks like an authority figure at the top of a hierarchy to be resented. And once competence collapses into power in these people's minds, resentment becomes inevitable. And that is precisely where status anxiety enters the picture. The psychological structure we're now confronting was laid out with unusual clarity by the British author Alain de Botton in his book Status Anxiety, published in 2004. De Botton's core insight was simple but devastating. In societies that promise equality of opportunity, status becomes morally radioactive. When a culture tells people that anyone can succeed, if they're talented enough, disciplined enough, smart enough, failure no longer feels like simple misfortune. It feels more like guilt. In older societies, status was largely inherited. Your position in life might be tragic, but not humiliating. In modern meritocratic societies, by contrast, status is supposed to be earned. And that means that when people don't rise, when they stall out, when they fall behind, the failure feels personal. It feels like a verdict on one's worth, and that produces an unbearable psychological pressure. As de Botton wrote, "Modern societies have perfected the art of humiliating people not by denying them opportunity, but by persuading them that they are entirely responsible for their own failures. De Botton's argument is that one of the most reliable ways human beings cope with this pressure is not self-improvement, but moral inversion. If you cannot achieve excellence, you reinterpret excellence as cruelty. If you cannot earn your way to the top of a hierarchy, you declare the idea of a hierarchy unjust. In this way, resentment masquerades as an ethics of resistance to something inherently oppressive. But this is nothing more than a psychological defense disguising itself as cutting-edge moral insight. This is the covert psychological layer hiding beneath what we're seeing at institutions like UCLA. Their overtly racist policies may not really be about helping the disadvantaged. They may be more about managing status anxiety, both for the people who fail to meet objective standards and for the administrators who must constantly justify their own authority inside institutions they did not build. When excellence becomes too threatening, the system adapts, not by elevating more people to excellence, but by redefining excellence downward. This also may be why their rhetoric, built around terms like lived experience, equity, inclusivity, emotional safety, sounds like an uncanny valley version of professional therapy. It mimics the language of care while stripping away the language of objective standards. Its function there may be to soothe the humiliation that meritocracy inevitably generates when people are promised open pathways to success but cannot achieve it. The problem is that once this therapeutic language is institutionalized, it doesn't just protect fragile egos. It deforms reality and increasingly allows incompetent people to fail upward. De Botton understood something else that's critical here. Status anxiety does not necessarily make people modest. More often, it makes them punitive. When people feel judged by standards they can't meet, they tend to demand that the standards change to accommodate them. In our situation, this most often manifests as demands for new standards that reward individuals based on their sense of identity or their stated grievances rather than their skills and talents. And once that shift is not only permitted but celebrated at scale, the decline of civilization becomes practically inevitable. As de Botton put it with unsettling directness, the desire to destroy anything that is excellent arises when people feel humiliated by their own shortcomings. Once that psychology takes hold in any culture, the problem is no longer merely institutional mismanagement. It becomes something much darker, a moral hostility toward greatness itself. There is one final dimension to this story that we haven't touched yet, and it may be the most important of all. If you've listened to my recent episodes, you probably recognize that this conversation has been building. In Which Humanity Survives, I asked what kind of people endure when pleasure displaces purpose. In Layers of Meaning in Human History, I explored how civilizations organize meaning once survival alone is no longer enough. This episode grows directly out of those questions, because once ambition, talent, and excellence themselves become morally suspect, the deeper crisis is no longer political or ideological. It is civilizational, because it's about the collapse of a shared sense of what is worth striving for as a species. And this is where the author, Ayn Rand, and her novel, The Fountainhead, enter the conversation. Ayn Rand was born in Russia and fled the Soviet Union as a young woman after watching a society organized entirely around enforced equality collapse into resentment and mass poverty. She arrived in the United States at a moment when the moral architecture here was almost completely the reverse, when ambition was admired, excellence was rewarded, and people were openly striving upward rather than being leveled down. And because she had seen both systems up close, she understood something most people never do: that decadence almost always arrives disguised as compassion through moral language that slowly drains a culture of its respect for great builders and dreamers. Ayn Rand's book, The Fountainhead, published in 1943, is not a book of political theory, it's a novel, a work of literature, and it stages this conflict psychologically and emotionally rather than academically. It tells the story of a brilliant but ostracized architect, Howard Rourke, whose only crime is independence of thought. His social sin is refusing to subordinate his artistic vision to the resentments of those who cannot build what he can. Around him orbit characters who live and die by the second-hand judgments of others: mediocre colleagues, industry critics, bureaucrats, tastemakers, people who derive all of their sense of self and meaning not from creation, but from trying to control and repress those who create. Now, it has become very fashionable to dismiss Ayn Rand these days, to roll one's eyes and reduce her work to some caricature. But that reflex, the instinct to sneer at her books like The Fountainhead, and especially her magnum opus Atlas Shrugged, rather than engage in good faith, is yet again part of the decadence I've been describing. Rand wasn't writing policy prescriptions, though. She was intentionally writing archetypes, casting her fictitious characters as either builders or parasites, makers or managers, people animated by the love of excellence or people animated by resentment toward it. Whatever you think of Rand's conclusions, she understood something essential that her critics miss. Civilizations do not collapse from a lack of great men and women who can achieve great things, but from a moral psychology that treats their greatness as arrogance and embraces its critique as virtue. When this happens, the builders are driven out of society. The Fountainhead captures this dynamic with unusual clarity because it shows what it feels like when a culture turns against its most capable people. Ayn Rand puts this psychology into words with almost surgical precision. At one point in The Fountainhead, she describes the hatred directed at a brilliant creator like the architect Howard Rourke. They hate him for being himself. He makes them feel small. He makes them feel unnecessary. He does not need them, and they know it. That is why they will forgive anything except greatness. They will forgive failure. They will forgive mediocrity. They will forgive corruption, but they will not forgive the man who does not need their approval. What The Fountainhead understands, better than almost any modern novel, is that greatness is not primarily enforced. It's attractive. Greatness exerts a gravitational pull on the human psyche. The protagonist, Howard Rourke, does not persuade people through arguments or moralizing. He moves them because his work is unmistakably alive. His architectural designs are objectively, self-evidently beautiful. As such, his work stirs something deep in the human mind that recognizes excellence and helplessly feels attracted to it. This is eros, not in the narrow sexual sense, but in the classical sense, the innate desire for what is higher, more ordered, more capable, the longing to participate in something worthy of devotion. When human beings encounter true beauty or mastery, they do not naturally experience it as oppression. They experience it as elevation, as a reminder of what is possible. And this is precisely why decadent culture grows hostile to it, because Eros exposes the distance between what one is and what one might have been. Ayn Rand understood that no civilization can survive on comfort, equity, or therapeutic reassurance alone. People do not give their best selves to safety. They give their best selves to real challenges, to goals that demand more of them than they thought themselves capable of. When greatness is removed as a goal, human energy does not disappear, it degrades. It becomes political, tribal, punitive. This is why the choice is never between compassion and greatness. That is a false dichotomy invented by small minds. The real choice is between civilizations that channel human striving upward and civilizations that force it to rot into grievance. What makes great people great and great civilizations great is that they expand the space in which human beings can thrive. Our present tragedy is not merely that Western civilization may be in decline. Civilizations always rise and fall. The real loss would be forgetting what human beings are capable of when they are invited to revere greatness, when they are given heroes instead of victims and winners instead of therapists. This is why moments like the mid-20th century still glow in our collective memory. They were animated by a shared upward gaze.
We have been given the scientific knowledge, the technical ability, and the materials to pursue the exploration of the universe. To ignore these great resources would be a corruption of a God-given ability.
10, 9, ignition sequence start. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running.
Space, the final frontier. A civilization still telling itself a story about exploration, courage, intelligence, and wonder. A future that required the greatest physicists, engineers, pilots, mathematicians, and dreamers we could produce, and that trusted them to lead us there. That spirit is not entirely gone just yet. You can still see it today wherever people are still willing to build big things and still willing to shoulder responsibility at scale. Figures, of course, like Elon Musk, who has almost single-handedly reintroduced civilizational ambition into a culture that had largely forgotten how to think beyond the next election cycle. Or Mark Andreessen and Ben Horowitz, whose investment philosophy is still grounded in a sense of awe for once-in-a-lifetime risk-takers and geniuses. And then there's the countless other builders we'll never hear about. The young scientists staying late in the lab night after night, preparing a dissertation defense that might unlock a new treatment for neurodegenerative disease. The engineer quietly refining a system that will never bear his name, but will make millions of lives safer. The writer working well after midnight once her kids are asleep, trying to articulate a fresh vision of heroism that can inspire a new generation of young people to ignore influencers and rediscover their own potential. The college student who raises her hand and says she disagrees with the entire class because the argument on the table violates first principles and historical reality. The astronaut who understands with full sobriety that he might die in the next launch, and so rather than hesitate, he's busy meeting with his lawyer to ensure his young family will be taken care of. These people are still everywhere, and they are the reason the future remains hopeful. And what they need, as much as anything, is a civilization that still remembers how to cheer them on and clear the way for them to see just how far they can go. That is the world the Fountainhead was written for. What Ayn Rand's novel ultimately asks is whether we still have the civilizational courage and confidence to ignore the cynics and declare that humanity is still only just getting started, and that when we empower the greatest among us, we can indeed achieve impossible things. I'm Brad Harris. So long.